Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I am Ted, your host, and this is going to be part 6 of our lectures detailing World War II. And in this lecture we are going to cover we're going to continue on with our lecture, our overview of the war in the Pacific. But before we begin that, I just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we concluded speaking about the battles of the Midway and the Coral Sea, how these were the first battles in history in which the first naval battles in which the fleets of the imposing navies never made contact. There would be no more of those up close and personal firing broadsides that had largely come to define naval warfare. These battles really rested on the naval air fleets of the Japanese and the United States. And it was really a smashing victory for the United States as they, at a very critical juncture, just as Japanese planes were stopping to refuel and rearm, the United States were able to attack the decks of 4 Japanese carriers, sinking them as the decks were cluttered with fuel hoses and bombs and men just scuttling about. We also looked at the Doolittle Raids and how it was a very audacious but not very effective militarily attack by the United States. In quick response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, American bombers were outfitted, they were enlarged, they were refitted, and a select group of pilots were brought into the secret program, and their mission was to fly from the USS Hornet to Tokyo and to bomb the Japanese mainland. The bombings themselves were not very effective, and the pilots, they did not have enough fuel to make it back to the USS Hornet. They had to fly over Japan after dropping their bombs and crash land, if their fuel held out, crash land into China. It was a very audacious move, and it was designed to be a public morale boost to illustrate at home that the United States military was capable of, even after the attack on Pearl Harbor, even after what was painted had a very devastating attack, it was able to rebound very quickly and make a direct strike upon the Japanese mainland, the Japanese archipelago. With that being said, let's dive right into our lecture topic for our lecture for today. And we're going to pick up with naval aviators, who had the most dangerous job in the Second World War. The seaborne aviators were at great risk, and all aviators were at great risk, and many of them died during their missions. But for pilots flying over land, they were confident at all times that the land was always there. You know, you could look down, you could see the land. You knew that if you had to make an emergency landing, that you would be able to. For seaborne aviators, it was a different scenario altogether. There was no reassurance that the ship you left on, that you left from, would be there when you return. The distances were vast in the Pacific, and it required expert navigation skills to relocate your carrier. Now, the Battle of the Midway is also notable for being fought some 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. In addition to all those hazards, landing on the carriers was a very difficult undertaking. In order to land on the carriers, the pilots had to catch an arrestor hook or tail hook to bring their planes to a stop. If they missed, they would just have to take off again. The alternative to taking off again would simply be them falling off the top of the ship into the sea. Now, American forces concentrated on capturing islands held by the Japanese, which could then be used to capture subsequent islands from which they could attack shipping lanes. And really put the squeeze on the main Japanese archipelago, on the main Japanese islands. There were 2 main strategies favored by the United States top military officials during this time. Admiral Nimitz, the naval commander, favored hopping from island to island on a direct collision course to Japan. General MacArthur, the army commander, favored a more southern route originating in Australia and marching through New Guinea and the Philippines, chipping away at the Japanese conquest. Now, MacArthur and Nimitz could not agree on a single course of action to take, so the American attack took place on two fronts. Half the United States established naval and later aerial supremacy. It became more difficult for the Japanese to reinforce and resupply their strategic bases. The great fault in the Japanese empire was that it was spread over such a wide and vast difference. It required great amounts of shipping to send vital supplies to their garrisons stationed there. American air raids on the Japanese shipping led to the near isolation of the Japanese garrisons. Now, in 1943, code breakers discovered that Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor raid, was going to be traveling with an air escort of Japanese fighters. Now, U.S. fighter planes intercepted his escort, his planes, and shot it down, killing him, and what became a great morale booster for the American soldiers, seamen, and airmen, and an immense morale dampener for the Japanese. Even with the codes broken, the overwhelming numerical and technological superiority of the fighting was desperately touch and go. Eventually, the American commander realized that the islands isolated. That with the islands isolated, it was not necessary to conquer every one, but to leave the islands that were isolated alone to wither on the vine, so to speak. Without supplies, without reinforcement, the supplies would dwindle. The men would simply be left idle, and starvation would set in. Now, the rationale behind bypassing fortified island strongholds was that they could not be resupplied from the Japanese fleet, they could not launch attacks, and were thus of no direct threat to the United States naval operations. Another key reason was that the islands, that when the islands were invaded, desperate battles ensued. The Japanese fought to the last man. When all hope was lost, they launched these devastating bayonet charges against attackers or committed suicide rather than being captured. On the island of Saipan, the garrison launched a bayonet charge that against the Americans that was met with machine gun fire, and it killed all of them. Now, the garrison's death led the Japanese civilian population to commit suicide on the island. The Battle of Saipan occurred in June of 1944, just after D-Day. From the fall of Saipan, the Japanese archipelago was in range of United States bombers, so the airstrips were built and bombers were brought in to Saipan. Now, the Battle of Saipan also had repercussions at home for the Japanese. The Japanese premier, General Tojo, was forced to resign. In the island campaigns, the Japanese suffered higher casualties due to the United States superior technology, but the Japanese fought with determination throughout it all. The Naked and the Dead by Norman Mailer provides an excellent view into what these island campaigns were like. Mailer himself was a first-hand witness to all of this. He enlisted in the Army and fought in the Pacific with the expectation that the experience, should he survive, would give him more than enough material to write what he envisioned as a great war novel. Now, there was a great fear involved in the invasion of these islands. The islands were very difficult to take. They were heavily assailed by naval artillery and airstrikes for several days. And Iwo Jima, for example, were reduced to ash before the Marines landed. All the vegetation had been burnt away, and the ensuing aerial bombing and naval artillery bombardment. The war was marked by episodes of dehumanization, with marked brutality and unreal non-malicious actions being perpetrated by both sides. There were some acts that that on the surface would just seem as malicious and inhumane, but really the men who were fighting it were just so demoralized that they could not readily counteract their own actions. There are stories of American soldiers, who will go to the dead Japanese and strip away the gold filling or the gold teeth from the Japanese dead. There's a story of a Japanese gunner who had died at his position, whose skull had been sheared clean off through gunfire or maybe through shrapnel, but the top of his skull was gone, and with it his brains. And a rain had come upon, and a puddle had been made in his vacant skull cavity. And there's a story of an American serviceman who just chipped stones into this empty cranial this empty cranial cavity, not out of any malicious nature or any sort of like malevolent intent, but sheer boredom. It was like skipping stones into an empty helmet. It was just something to do as you waited to get your orders. Episodes like that, like those, sort of came to really encapsulate the war experience as service members made these island-to-island hops. One of the great insights of the United States military was the languages with the use of the languages of the Native Americans, who were certainly which were certainly unknown to the enemies, in an effort to maintain the code, to ensure that their codes, their strategic codes, were not broken. They simply abandoned previous codes and simply used Native Americans to speak to each other. They drafted a group, and particularly one of the most famous groups were the Windtalkers. These were a group of Navajo men who were recruited from Native American reservations, drafted into the United States Army, and they spoke to each other, detailing what their different units, what their different commands were doing. They spoke to each other, and they did so with the full confidence that the Japanese would not be able to break these codes. The Japanese were never able to decipher these codes. This was just alien knowledge to them. This was an alien language to them. They were simply blindsided by these events. The Windtalkers will play a major role in the United States' ability to freely communicate without the fear that their codes would be broken. Now, the largest naval battle in history took place during World War II, and this is the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. And this occurred in October of 1944. And this battle was a part of General MacArthur's plan to, a part of his successful landing in the Philippines. And it was a great propaganda boom. MacArthur had promised to return, and 3 years later he did it. It was a wonderful bit of propaganda for the United States military. And just as this was happening, a very virulent strain of anti-Japanese propaganda was sweeping the Republic. The strain of racism was vicious in nature and accompanied by detestable caricatures of the Japanese. It accentuated the racial features, or the proposed racial features of the Japanese. Glasses wearing, buck teeth, short stature, just virulent strain. The Japanese were much more hated in the United States than in any other group at that time. They were hated because of the Bataan March. They were hated because of the Pearl Harbor attack. They're hated because of the conquest of the Philippines, because of the hardships that everyone saw, that quickly became apparent to everybody, the hardships of fighting in the Pacific. And moreover, they were hated because they were Asiatic. Earlier, we had noted that there was this virulent strain of anti-Chinese propaganda, these Chinese exclusion laws that reared its head in California and quickly swept the rest of the nation. The Chinese passed the hated Asiatic baton to the to the Japanese became the most detested group at this time. Though many in the United States appreciated that the Germans needed to be defeated much more than the Japanese, the majority of the population were much more intensely focused on seeing Japan defeated. As the war approached the Japanese archipelago in 1944, resistance stiffened, and the campaign against Iwo Jima left 7,000 dead and 13,000 wounded. Now, Iwo Jima is a very small island. It's only about 5 square miles, but the Japanese defenders were dug in, and they fought tenaciously as the United States assaults continued. The continuing struggle for the American forces led to, as they were taking the island, led to the now famous photograph of the flag raising on Mount Surabaki. And just one more sort of note on the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I have a sort of unique connection to Leyte Gulf, me and I guess thousands of others. When I enlisted, my unit, the 1st Battalion, 34th Infantry, they are known as the Leyte Dragons. They fought the Battle of Leyte, and they fought bravely, and they earned that designation, Leyte Dragons. Very cool bit of history to be attached to. Now, after Iwo Jima, came the Okinawa campaign, which was even more costly, as over 12,000 Americans died. And 50,000 were wounded as American forces took Okinawa. The Okinawa campaign was also notable for the emergence of the kamikaze aircrafts. The kamikaze aircrafts were filled with explosives, and the pilot was locked into the cockpit. Furthermore, the pilot was given only enough fuel to fly out to the target site, or the target fleet area. They targeted American bases, American forces, but also American ships. The mission was to fly the target, fly into the target, and inflict as much damage as possible to the approaching enemy fleet. They, needless to say, were a very terrifying weapon to confront. Kamikaze itself is a reference to a divine wind that saved Japan from a proposed Mongol invasion centuries earlier. And kamikaze itself means divine wind. And before they left on their mission, the pilots would enjoy a ceremonial drink of sake to sort of reinforce the significance, the national significance of their mission. And with that, we'll break here and we'll come back with part 7 of our lecture series. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this. And as always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.